So you've helped your client identify some potential areas of improvement and development towards their big picture goals that they want to achieve through the coaching experience and beyond. They're learning about themselves. They're learning about what's most important. It's time to begin moving towards action and planning. How do we help a client take that great learning and awareness and apply it to something more concrete and actionable at near the end of a session, which is oftentimes when this is happening? A wonderful framework for creating a more solid and actionable plan in a coaching session is referred to as a SMART goal. And there are a lot of different frameworks out there, and I'm actually going to be considering SMART more in terms of action planning rather than a long-term goal setting process. So when it comes to a SMART goal, we'll talk about each part of that acronym, but then there's other considerations to think about as well, things that are also just as important in a coaching setting that go beyond what the SMART acronym is looking at. But let's start with that SMART acronym and how it could be applied in a coaching setting. So S stands for specific. A person could come into a session and be getting some awareness, and they realize, oh, you know what? I really need to go for that promotion. Or I really do need to start eating more healthy. I really do need to have a better relationship with my child or my parent or whoever. Yeah, well, these are wonderful intentions, and they're categories where there can be some goals and action steps, but they're just intentions for now. The S means that we're going to narrow things down to a very specific next step. And when we're looking at the competencies 9 through 11 with the International Coach Federation, we are wanting to cultivate a better understanding of a very specific action that can be taken by this person to help them along the path to get their intention accomplished. So if they're looking for promotion, the specific thing that they could do is like, oh, well, now that I've been talking this through, I guess a next step would be for me to have a conversation with my manager about what are the expectations, like what do I need to do in order to get a promotion. That's a really good next step, because the best way to know how to prepare for a test is to ask the teacher what's going to be on the test. The best way to prepare for a promotion is to ask the manager, what are some of the expectations from the organization in order to be ready for a promotion, the next stage in my professional development. It's a very kind of obvious next step, and it's very specific, and we can begin acting on it fairly quickly. And we can look at almost any intention and narrow that scope down to something very very specific. Measurable comes next. Very specific and more easily digestible. A coach often will ask questions like, so what, as you think about this overall goal that you want to achieve over a given period of time, what do you feel is the next step you can take over the next week or a week or two in order to begin the journey to the goal? Okay, so I'm going to begin eating so much, or I'm going to get to a narrower scope with this and be more specific. Beyond that, we look at measurability. How can we make sure this specific thing is happening along the way so that while this next week or two goes by, the client is making progress, incremental progress each day towards that very important specific action step that they want to have taken. So if they want to have this conversation with their manager next week, what do they need to do ahead of time to measure success towards that? I mean, the overall measure of success of having a conversation next week is pretty straightforward, but we also need to do some other things, some measures of when are you going to have reached out, and how will you know that this is going to actually happen. You need to have the conversation with the executive assistant to make sure it's on the schedule and all that good stuff. There's some incremental progress that we can set up, some milestones for that incremental progress, and those are measures of success. Another measure of success would be around, let's say, exercise or nutrition. I want to make sure to eat so many healthy meals a day. I want to eat at least 2 of the 3 meals I eat will focus heavily on vegetables, as like 80% vegetables, in order to increase my vegetable intake. And they'll all be organic and really, really great food this many times a day. Or I'm going to go to the gym this many times a week. You can measure success throughout the week by checking off how many of those wonderful vegetable-driven meals are there, or how many of those exercise days where you go to the gym, how many of those have happened? There's measurability instead of just the specific, I'm going to go to the gym more often this week. Next, attainability. This is the idea that I can do this. When a person is just entering the coaching relationship, one of the things they learn through the process is how to make sure to phrase their goals and their actions in ways that highlight their part and their responsibility. This is something that the coach, if the client doesn't do that, the coach is going to check in with them on it, because I can't make my goal. My goal shouldn't be my wife is going to be happier. Like, that's not healthy for me to make my success about her being happier. My manager is going to like me more. My manager is going to give me that promotion. My success shouldn't be measured in terms of what this other person's going to do. My teacher is going to give me a better grade on the test. Well, that's really putting a lot of responsibility on the teacher to do some performing. We want to make sure things are phrased in an attainable way as well as a positive way, something that the client is doing, not avoiding. I'm going to avoid eating so much candy, but as they're stepping away from candy, maybe throughout the week, what are they replacing that with? Something that they can be in charge of and they are taking responsibility for. The coach can co-design using some questions that we'll have up here, co-design with the client how to make an action more attainable. Next, we want to make sure this is relevant. If a client is doing something because the coach expects it of them, that's not really good coaching. And if a client is doing something just because the manager is expecting it of them, the motivation is going to be fairly poor, and the movement forward is also going to be fairly low. The success rate of following through on that kind of action is going to be, fairly minimal. Whenever a client is sharing an intention, sharing a goal, refining it into a clear action plan, the coach ought to take one or two moments, or one or two questions to probe and to ask questions about essentially why. And sometimes I do ask that question. I enjoy asking why questions just to play a little bit. So I'll often say, so this sounds good. Why bother? Why bother reaching out to your manager next week and getting something on the calendar by this Friday? It's clearly the way I'm saying it is meant to say, like, let's just revisit. Like, what's the motivation? And you can just say that. What's the motivation for this? Why is it so important to you? What makes this a valuable use of your time to follow through on this action plan? It's good to check in because it gets at the significance. And if there is any indication that the why or the motivation is dependent on someone else, well, I just need to make this other person happy, it's just expected of me, we need to probe deeper to explore what's really at stake. If this person doesn't follow through, what happens then? If they do follow through, what are the benefits to them and to others and to their overall future with their company or with their family or whatever party's at stake? We want to make sure this is relevant to the individual being coached, not just the people in their lives. And then finally, we want to make sure the action plan has a deadline or some sort of time. It's time specific. I don't know if I want to say time specificity, but it is time bound and time specific. They are going to be going to the gym Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Okay, great. When do you want to go to the gym on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday? Oh, okay. And so on. So at what time of day, what day of the week do you want to make sure to get in touch with the executive assistant to book the time on the calendar of your manager? Okay, great. There's a timeline. And so sometimes, like, I'm going to have a conversation with my manager next week. There may be some challenges to make that happen. So let's make sure to create some sort of deadline together around when this person is going to follow through on the part they can control, which is having the conversation with the executive assistant to get something on the calendar. Also, another really basic thing is as we are doing like accountability and asking, how do you want to remind yourself to follow through on this intention and action? We can make sure the reminder setting is also time specific. Okay, great. When are you going to make the reminder? And yeah, it can be a bit obnoxious in a way. And I often say, hey, I know I'm going to be obnoxious, but when are you going to set that reminder? But a lot of times a client's going to say, you know what, that's a good point. Let me do it right now. Great. We're on the right track. So we want to make sure things are specific, measurable, attainable, they can do it, relevant, it matters to them, and time specific. They know when it's going to happen and how to track things in order according to time. But there are other parts around action planning and goal setting and accountability that are also just as important as the SMART framework. And those things are, what is this person learning as they are sharing these things? What do they hope to learn in following through with this action plan? Because once a person has fleshed out a plan, there's going to be some new awareness that comes from that process in and of itself. So a good question there might be, as you've laid all of this out and you're kind of visualizing what this next week and a half is going to be like, what are you noticing? What are you taking away from this exploration? What are you learning about yourself? What are you learning about your ability to handle this kind of situation? These questions are really the point of coaching. It's not just fixing the problem and creating the SMART goal or creating the action plan. It's what do you learn and how do you grow through that process? Next is another thing that is part of the planning is how do you pivot? If there is some sort of situation where the person may need to switch directions, they have multiple interviews with different companies that are coming up in the next 2 weeks, how will they know when to maybe focus in on one organization and begin to say yes versus how will they know when to continue on with the other interviews? There's some ongoing decision making that might pivot the direction of the SMART goal, and they may set aside the one SMART action plan and go with an alternative SMART action plan that could also be designed with the coach and the client. So maybe exploring how will you know when you need to change direction? And finally, accountability. How do you hold yourself accountable to this goal? This is a part of the attainability piece. This is part of the specificity, measurability, and time specific. Accountability is all part of those things, but just want to highlight the coach does need to be able to explore accountability with the client. You have this wonderful SMART action plan all set up. How do you want to make sure you follow through this next week? What accountability structure do you want to have in place? And so on. So I don't know what acronym we add to the end there, but it's SMART plus learning and accountability and the ability to pivot. Practice these things. Maybe check out the session sidebar that's a part of the show notes here. And make sure that when you're wrapping up and creating action steps that you cover these things. And through that, you're going to see a better follow through. The ability for the client to act is going to grow, and their understanding of how to bring better actions to the table, that's going to grow over time, as well as they are kind of teaching themselves how to coach themselves even more effectively. So I hope this is helpful. Keep coaching, keep growing, and thank you for tuning in.